we have raised a lot of questions about the effectiveness of anti-money laundering, how the developing countries like Vietnam can adopt those algorithms effectively if we are short of resources.
In this episode of Mekong Matters, we explore money laundering in Vietnam. The rapid expansion of peer-to-peer lending, often operated by fintech companies operating outside traditional banking channels, lack basic anti-money laundering safeguards, such as know your customer or customer due diligence, making them vulnerable to the laundering of illicit proceeds. They exploit loopholes by registering as IT services or investment consultants and practice predatory lending techniques with exorbitantly high interest rates of 300 to 400% a year, well above the legal cap of 20%. Some money lenders have direct connections to trafficking networks and migration brokers who use debt bondage to threaten the families of trafficking victims. In December 2025, Vietnamese police dismantled an alleged criminal network involved in a range of illicit activities such as drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and illegal money lending. Unsecured loans were offered at annual interest rates of up to 670%. Vietnam is also a leader in cryptocurrency adoptions, where it is used as everyday infrastructure for remittance, gaming, and savings. But between early 2024 and mid-2025, there was a surge in crypto-related criminal activities, such as investment fraud and transnational money laundering. One such example was the digital token known as Paynet Coin or PAIN, which was dismantled by police in 2025, described as Vietnam's largest crypto fraud, defrauding investors an estimated $2 billion. It's issues such as this that landed Vietnam on the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF Grey List in 2023, a global watch list for countries with weaknesses in combating money laundering and terrorist financing. The Vietnamese government has taken steps to get off the FATF Grey List, and that's what we'll be discussing today with Nguyen, Senior Lecturer at the University of Canterbury's Faculty of Law.
FATF, the Finance Action Task Force, have categorized blacklist and grey list. The blacklist is like the high-risk jurisdictions. They have serious inadequacies in anti-money laundering standards. Grey list includes a country known as jurisdiction subject to increased monitoring. So it's not bad like blacklist countries, but the grey list countries still have significant weaknesses in their anti-money laundering regimes. So it means Vietnam identifies as a country which has serious loopholes in the anti-money laundering regimes, including the legal framework and the practice.
There is also an outlined action plans for Vietnam to get removed from this grey list. Can you elaborate a little bit?
All the countries don't want to be on the list. It's bad for that reputation. It affects the investment capital and also the finance market. Having been aware of that impacts, the Vietnamese government and also the relevant agencies have been working hard to adopt new laws, to amend the existing laws, and try to make Vietnamese anti-money laundering laws to be compliant with international standards as much as possible. Basically, Vietnam has sufficient laws on the book, but the implementation of the relevant laws in practice is still limited, I would say, because of a number of factors. Firstly, the political will. Secondly, the resources, anti-money laundering regime, and the anti-money laundering measures. Adoption of those methods are costly, not only for the government agencies, but also for the financial institutions.
We highlighted in the introductions that the adoption of cryptocurrencies and digital access in Vietnam is quite high, which has come with problems. In what way is the state trying to deal with this issue?
I think that is an emerging issue. Money launderers and criminals are trying to find the new ways and new techniques to launder money. And using cryptocurrency is one of the emerging methods. Firstly, sending money overseas in Vietnam is very difficult. It's not like in Europe or here in New Zealand. You can use internet banking to send money overseas easily without any questions from banks, right? You just put bank account and details and then money would be sent to anywhere in the world. But that cannot be done in Vietnam. When you want to send the money overseas, you need to get permission. But when you use peer-to-peer, especially using cryptocurrency to send money overseas, you don't need to ask anyone and no fees. The problem is that uh, Vietnam doesn't have current effective laws to regulate cryptocurrencies, especially to prevent and identify how criminals use cryptocurrency for money laundering. The digital technology law was adopted last year and I think has been in effect from January 2026 and has a good legal framework to recognize digital currency as a kind of digital assets, cryptocurrency as digital assets and subject to the civil law.
It just feels like this landscape is like constantly changing, and governments around the world, not just Vietnam, has to like constantly finding way to adapt, right?
The anti-money laundering standards were created by the Western countries with highly or advanced financial structure. And now those measures are being adopted in developing or less developed countries. So you can see that we would have to raise question whether those measures would fit to the less developed or developing economic infrastructure. We, the developed country, didn't contribute to the development of anti-money laundering standards. We are objectively pushed, and that's why we are not voluntary, and we are not ready for that. Right? And it's very costly. That's why the politicians and the governments, they are reluctant to adopt it until they have been put on the grey list, which would be harmful for the economies and in the international forum. Getting out of the list is not a difficult job. But how Vietnam can be voluntary, right, in adopting or in implementing the anti-money laundering measures is a bigger problem. The public, law enforcement agencies, and the government seems not to be clear about the harms of money laundering. That's why I'm not sure that what Vietnam is doing or will do in the future will satisfy the calculation of cost benefit.
Other old school at-risk assets, such as gold and real estate, for example, alongside cryptos, are also receiving greater scrutiny. What changes have been made?
In the old days, cash smuggling or precious stones or gold, all those things were the traditional tools, to launder money. They are still being used in these days, especially in cash-based economy like Vietnam. In recent years, Vietnamese use banks and also use cash less than before, but still very popular. You can see that. Cash is being used for the daily transactions and still be accepted. And banks would have no question when you bring cash to the bank. The Vietnamese government, I have observed, hasn't adopted any measures that try to reduce the use of cash in daily transaction, and that is still one of the challenges in Vietnam.
Outside the large city in remote area where ethnic minority people in Vietnam, like they don't speak the Vietnamese language, they speak their own language, they can't write, then it's very difficult for them to open a bank account as well.
These are something that the banks should think about, how to provide more services and give people in the rural area access to banks services to reduce cash flow in the market.
There is a suggestion that parallel financial investigations, which are essentially a financial case alongside primary criminal case such as drug trafficking or fraud, which you mentioned earlier. Have we seen examples of parallel financial investigations in Vietnam yet?
Originally, combating money laundering is a kind of additional approach to combating other transnational crimes. Initially, it was additional measures or approach to the fight against drug trafficking. And then it has been expanded to combat other offenses. The law enforcement agency, particularly the police, sometimes they don't bother to pursue a money laundering prosecution along with other charges. They would focus on the predicate offenses like human trafficking, fraud, or corruption. There's a number of reasons. The motivation, the resources, why they have to pursue money laundering charges when they have already persecuted or have put charges for other offenses. What would be the motivation? Yeah, they may only focus on confiscating criminal process rather than just pursuing another charge because they have limited resources. But one of the criteria set up by FATF is that, well, when you see that now not many persons have been prosecuted for money laundering, it means that the law in action doesn't look good. We can see about some fraud cases recently, even corruption cases, when the defendant was prosecuted of fraud billions of dollars. In the meantime, money laundering charge was submitted.
So it is safe to say that there is the collaboration between cross-sector in Vietnam is better than before.
Absolutely. It was not easy to prosecute or to convict someone of money laundering in the past because of limited resources, but also because of the legal knowledge of the police and the charges. In recent years, they understand the law related to money laundering better than before.
Vietnam remains on the grey list for the time being. From the action taken so far, I think you already said that there is political will to make the necessary anti-money laundering and compliance changes. But what more needed to be done to help our country to get out of this grey list?
I believe Vietnam will get out of the grey list very soon. The government has shown there's high commitment to adopt new laws, to amend the existing laws. And in practice, they are pushing financial institutions, the designated non-financial businesses and professions to adopt anti-money laundering measures. Banks and financial institutions and other agencies, they are adopting those measures. They show that they are committed. We have achieved positive outcomes. For example, more money laundering prosecutions recently, laws on enterprises, the digital technology law, and all those laws. And I would say that in very near future, the law on the books would have a good compliance rate to the FATF standards. But how effective we would do in practice is still a big question. As I said, it depends on so many factors.
Thank you to Nguyen for joining us in this episode of Mekong Matters. For more insights into organized crime across the Mekong, stay tuned for our monthly Mekong Matters podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. I'm Trang Nguyen. Thank you for listening.